So our first speaker this afternoon is Mario Herrera from CSIRO, okay, and he's a chief research scientist there, and he's has more than 20 years of experience of working on strategic research projects on livestock, livelihoods, and environmental interactions in Africa, Latin America, Asia, and Europe. Prior to joining CSIRO, he led the ILRI's Sustainable Livestock Futures program, and he has done work on strategic and policy-oriented think tank type work, and he's achieved a number of benefits in terms of that kind of work going forward. So he's going to speak this afternoon to you on and the title of his talk is Global Livestock, the Status, the Trends, the Prospects, and the Role of Animal Nutrition. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Herrera.
Thanks, Mark. With all of you, yes, I was given the opportunity to give you a brief overview of the global livestock sector, and what I'll try to do is to bring animal nutrition aspects throughout the presentation to see really how it can actually help us in solving some of the key issues here that we have. Let me see. Okay. I always like to start a presentation like this with the big numbers, and by this I mean, look, we have almost 20 billion animals at the moment, and using 30% of the Earth's surface, a third of the global cropland, emitting between 8 and 18% of greenhouse gases, causing 72% of the deforestation of the world, and using 32% of the global freshwater consumption. I mean, these are pretty big numbers that when you actually put them together with an increase, a very significant increase in consumption of due primarily to increases in affluency and also urbanization, well, then you end up with numbers like these ones. And these numbers actually tell you that basically we're going to need probably to double meat and milk production to meet societal needs, and that this growth will come primarily in the developing world, simply because, well, that's where population is growing faster, and also it's where increases in income are occurring at a faster rate. Having said that, even with these kinds of numbers, look at the consumption per capita. It doesn't even reach the consumption levels of the developed world in the year 2000. So even with this magnitude of absolute increases, there's still a long way to go. Now, these kinds of big numbers, of course, create a lot of public scares. Look, you get all sorts of things about how livestock can be the polluters of the world, how inefficient they are, and believe me, before I was at ILRI and I had to deal, I used to lead the livestock and environment program, I had to deal with this stuff all the time. I had to deal with the press, with the vegans, with Greenpeace, with you name it. So I developed a very thick skin. But, you know, the second part of the story is that there's very little public recognition of livestock socioeconomic roles. And why? Well, that's actually partly because we are very poor at providing the right messages and actually emphasizing the beneficial aspects. Just look at this. 1.3 trillion in terms of the asset value of the animals only. This is an enormous amount of money. 1.3 billion people employed in value chains. These are equally big numbers, but also very positive economic numbers for the world. 30 to 50% of agricultural GDP. Yes, tell a finance minister to get rid of 30 to 40% of the agriculture GDP, and let's see what he or she says. So look, there is a balance in all this message that we really need to be able to articulate a lot better. We've heard before that livestock are key for nutritional security, and in poor countries, they are a very important tool for risk management. They're basically walking banks, and they support about 600 million people in the world. So the nutrition aspect, I think that we've already touched on it. I'll pass on this. But more importantly, look, it's one thing that we really need to recognize is that, especially in the developing world, it is an incredibly dynamic system. And it is actually a system that is creating very important land use transitions that we actually need to recognize, because these land use transitions will also lead to different needs in terms of development of value chains, research needs in terms of animal nutrition, research needs in terms of health, different implications for what may happen to different diseases, etc. So the target is moving. Now, how do we design research that can actually cope with this significant dynamism is something that we really need to take into account when we look at pictures like this. This is a clear transition from pastoral systems over 40 years towards crop livestock systems in West Africa due to basically land fragmentation, more population in these systems, etc. Just imagine from an animal nutritionist, well, the kinds of research needs and how they would evolve in terms of how are we going to feed these animals, and also will there be enough biomass, etc. These are the kinds of things we need to be also having in the back of our minds to be able to design sustainable solutions in the future. Now, within this context, I'd like to say something about what's been happening in terms of future trends. And we've seen a lot of global economic and environmental assessments talking about how to feed 9-10 billion people in the future. And what comes out of this is that definitely we're going to be able to feed 9-10 billion people, but I think the question is, well, at what social and environmental cost? I think that there's enough dynamism in food trade. Prices will control some aspects of demand and supply. There is still a bit of land expansion. Some intensification might or may not happen. But what is very clear is that if we continue with the business as usual kinds of trends, we will not meet key environmental goals in terms of, for example, greenhouse gases. We may end up with water getting depleted, etc. So, I mean, there is a room for improvement. There are things that we need to do to sustainably intensify the systems and to be able to actually reduce environmental footprints and so on. What can we do about this? Well, I think that there's now 3 recognized ways in which we can achieve this. Reducing food waste would be one, and I'm not going to talk about this one, but there's up to 30-40% of waste in the food value chain, and there's definitely significant improvement that we could actually try to achieve there. But definitely, traditionally, we've tried to increase food, in this case, livestock production. And also, there's a conversation starting to happen about whether the demand trajectories for livestock products are sustainable or not. And this is something that Teresa, I think, touched a little bit upon. Well, food. I'm going to start with the sustainable diets because this is a topic that it's quite contentious from a livestock perspective. And it all boils down to the fact of whether to eat or not to eat meat. It's really something that is definitely a duality. We know that there's a double burden of nutrition, that we know that it could contribute to obesity in some parts. But look, as we were discussing this morning, there's a lot of epidemiological work that needs to, it's been mostly epidemiological work, and perhaps we need some real hard data to really come up with a better message on this. But, you know, from my perspective, I think that globally we really need to do much better at differentiating this message, primarily because in the developing world, well, there's still a lot of undernutrition that needs to be well taken care of. Also, you know, the environmental community has been very good at showing how, well, it's almost like a no-brainer. If you basically get rid of the largest land use system on Earth, well, it is likely that you're going to spare some land and that you're going to end up with greenhouse gas savings. And this is all fine. And you know, this has actually led to a great body of work. But what these assessments don't tell us are, well, what are going to be the social, the economic impacts, the nutritional impacts? You're not going to get rid of, again, of 1.3 billion people employed in value chains. So I would love to see the next set of analysis around this topic with a lot more sophistication, adding employment effects, income effects, etc., to really be able to see, well, can we really modify human diets in any the livestock component in human diets in any meaningful way, so as to, well, also improve environmental health. This is the typical data that we get, and this is a graph from Steffes et al. That showed basically that, yes, you get greenhouse gas emission savings with a range of different variants in comparison to the reference scenario. And here they were using as a healthy diet the Willett diet, well, applied to the globe, which is, I don't know how, that's a phenomenal assumption. But yes, you do get these kinds of improvements. But as I said, it's something we need to acknowledge as part of the livestock community. This is coming. The agenda is moving towards nutritional security. And we look, it would be a lot better if this were led by us than by a lot of people that have a vested interest in seeing the industry getting hammered. So, but there's some truth in terms of that what we eat matters, in a sense, because as we know, greenhouse gas emissions intensities of different animal products are very different, with monogastrics often being more efficient, and with beef there being, well, having a very broad range of greenhouse gas emissions intensities in the past. Now, if we look at consumption patterns, one thing that we're observing globally is that people love chicken, pork, and milk. This is really where all the growth in the sector is actually happening. And these transitions from red to more white meats are, in fact, improving greenhouse gas efficiencies per unit of consumed livestock product. So this is an example, for example, for Africa. And what we see is that if we project for all the African regions the consumptions of these different products, we're going to see decreases in the greenhouse gases. Nevertheless, because we're going to have a lot more people, you end up needing, if it's especially via the monogastric way, we're going to end up needing a lot more grains. And this is something that, well, we'll need to see how we're going to accommodate. Are we going to exploit yield gaps? Are we going to expand land to certain places? And are we going to is there still a frontier there of efficiency that we can actually improve? Or is it basically via management or other ways? Now I want to put this in the context of sustainable intensification. This is a term that you've heard a lot. And what does this mean from a livestock perspective? Well, if you look at this map, this is some work that we did looking at doing an inventory of global feed consumption, productivity, greenhouse gases, etc. And if you look at the purple areas, these are areas that, for example, are very inefficient from a greenhouse gas perspective, and this is simply because they have animals consume very poor diets. But you know, I see this as a real opportunity. I don't see it as a real problem. Well, Africa, the hotspot of inefficiency. Well, just imagine that if you look at the graph that you have here, this is a graph, well, I'm preaching to the converted a little bit here, but this is the energy density of the diet and the methane, the kilograms per kilo of product produced. And as you can see that as you improve the diet, well, those emissions intensities decrease. So if we could actually improve the diets of these animals, where there's that phenomenal scope, we could actually very quickly make important improvements in the environmental performance of these systems, but very importantly, while providing a hell of a lot more protein for consumers. These are the typical examples that we see in the literature, and there are many. There are many like these. These are actually some districts in Kenya where you have a supplementation scenario with prosopis, desmodium, Napier grass, and a range of others. And what you see here is the percentage increases in milk production relative to a baseline. So what you can see is that, well, you can really increase by feeding 1-2 kilos of key feeds. You could actually really increase milk production and at the same time have beneficial effects on the environment. We need to do these kinds of things much more. And very importantly, we could try to do this. We could actually try to produce more milk, but perhaps with less numbers of animals. And this has an added beneficial effect that we may end up being able also to spare land for other purposes as well. And this is something that, especially in smallholder systems that are very biomass constrained, is something that we really need to think about. Because in some cases, population densities are so high, and if you're going to have 1 or 2 animals, well, it's probably much better to have a couple of animals that are really going to produce and that are really going to be very efficient, rather than having 3 or 4 where most of the feed will go into their maintenance requirements. This is something that we need to think. So I'm very sorry for the horrendogram here, and here you don't see actually the title, but what we see here is something, we put these kinds of results of improved feeding in a global change model, just to see, well, what would happen if a scenario where we feed animals better, what would happen to the animal protein supply? And what we see here is, I'll just give you the gist of the story, and I don't know if I can probably point here. So this basically, the story goes that between the 2 scenarios, you can, oh, okay, this is not pointing. Okay, so basically you get more milk with less animals. This leads to less land use change. Yes, you increase the amount of cropland that you need to feed a little bit, but this amount compensates for a real increase in efficiency. And then what tends to happen is that you end up reducing CO2 emissions primarily. You reduce methane emissions a little bit because of the reductions in animal numbers, but this has a phenomenal indirect effect when you link the animal nutrition interventions with the land use. And these are the kinds of things that, well, for example, in the IPCC, and this where we're really trying to see, well, what would be the mechanisms for creating policies and incentives that would lead to these kinds to the uptakes of these technologies and to these kinds of results. Obviously, and I think that this has been mentioned here before, there's trade-offs and synergies. I really don't believe that there's a free lunch. And we were discussing in our group that it's really like pressing a balloon. When we start improving efficiencies and perhaps going for more, for feeding more grains, perhaps we're going to be altering what happens with water. And sometimes this may happen in the same production system, but sometimes it may happen in different parts of the world. I start intensifying, this creates an increase in demand for grains. You end up chopping part of the Amazon for converting the forest, and then you have these effects in different parts of the world. And this is something that we need to start really understanding much better to really create truly sustainable livestock systems. Now, these are my last slides. I want to talk a little bit about livestock data generation and consolidation. Look, I've been working a lot with the global change community, First, because I saw a range of assessments about livestock with very, very poor data or no livestock at all. And therefore, when I was at Tilbury, we thought, look, it is our responsibility to start generating some of this information for these global assessments to get livestock right, is what we were saying at the moment. But you know, it's not only ILRI, it's not only the international organizations, it's all of us. We haven't done a good effort at consolidating all the data that we have, be it from trials, be it from inventories of animals, be it from feeding practices, etc. This is the kind of information that would actually help us understand much better livestock systems around the world. And we need to consolidate a little bit as a community, I think. The crop people have been very, very good at organizing, look, from their model intercomparisons to standard data files for running and testing their models, putting repositories of information on statistics outside for different countries and so on. We need to do the same, and I think that this is the time. Let me pass these. And look, I'm going to just finish with this slide. I think that there are key aspects for ruminant nutrition work that we need to try in the coming decades to bring to the fore. Look, the days of the animal scientists just running a trial and then basically not interacting with the rest of the community or the rest of the sector, just putting the paper in animal science and that was it, I think those days are gone. We really need to think of how to integrate with the sector and with the value chains that dominate the sector. It's really important that we take a farming systems perspective, and we need to work with the land use change people as well. We really could do a lot better at integrating with the global change community, and there could be well-established mechanisms for doing that. And then, there seems to be a lot of technical options that are very well proven from different parts around the world. We need to really understand their adoption is very low. And you may wonder why. And look, there's plenty of good technology on the shelf, but on the shelf for a good reason. So let's see how we can actually work on what are the costs, what are the economic incentives farmers may have, etc. As part of this, I think, well, inevitably, we need much better livestock models. That will always come. There's plenty of uncertainty in all this work that we do. And I think that, well, this is a key topic of this meeting. And as I said, data consolidation will be a key piece of the puzzle. Thanks a lot.